It all started with a fence, not a broken one, not an eyesore, but a simple, sturdy wooden privacy fence that had stood on the edge of the yard for years. It was built by the previous homeowner, long before I moved into the neighborhood. When I bought the house, the fence was already there, separating my property from my neighbors. I never gave it much thought until Karen moved in next door. Karen was the kind of neighbor you notice immediately, not because she's friendly, but because she makes herself impossible to ignore. From the day she arrived, she had an opinion about everything. The length of the grass, the cars parked on the street, even the color of my shutters. But her favorite target, the one that consumed her attention, was my fence. At first, it started with harmless comments muttered loud enough for me to hear while I worked in the yard. She would shake her head, arms folded, staring at the fence as if it had committed some unforgivable crime. Soon, those mutters turned into complaints. She claimed it was too close to her property. She said it made her yard feel smaller, like I was stealing space from her. But the truth was, the fence hadn't moved an inch since the day I bought the house. The complaints escalated quickly. Karen contacted the HOA, filing formal complaints about the fence. I received letters accusing me of encroaching on her property line. The HOA, eager to flex its authority, sent warnings demanding that I move or remove the fence within 30 days. They cited Karen's claim that the fence stood several feet over her property line, making it an unauthorized structure. I was shocked. I had no reason to doubt the fence's location. Still, doubt crept in. What if Karen was right? What if the fence really was on her land? Could I be forced to tear it down? I spent days pacing my backyard, staring at the wooden panels, as if they held the answers. My frustration grew as I watched Karen smirk from her porch, confident that her complaints would win. The HOA's letters grew more threatening, warning of fines and legal action if I didn't comply. I knew I needed proof, something that would silence both Karen and the HOA once and for all. That's when I decided to dig deeper, literally and figuratively. I contacted the county clerk's office, pulled up the original property survey, and even arranged for a new professional survey to be conducted. If the fence really was on her property, I'd accept it. But if it wasn't, then Karen had just started a war she couldn't win. The day the surveyors arrived, Karen hovered nearby, arms crossed and eyes narrowed like a hawk waiting for prey. She looked so sure of herself, as if the results would vindicate her crusade against me. But as the stakes grew higher, so did my determination. I wasn't about to let Karen bully me into tearing down something that was rightfully mine. What happened next would not only change the way I saw Karen, but it would also unravel secrets about the property that neither of us expected. And when the truth came out, it wouldn't just embarrass her, it would backfire in a way that made the entire neighborhood turn against her. But at that point, I had no idea. All I knew was that the battle of the fence had officially begun. The morning of the survey felt heavier than it should have. For most people, a property survey is a routine formality, something done quietly in the background. But here, in my neighborhood, it had become a spectacle. Word had spread quickly thanks to Karen, who made sure everyone knew about her fence problem. By the time the survey team arrived with their tripods and equipment, several curious neighbors had gathered at the edges of their lawns, whispering and pointing as if a courtroom trial was about to take place. Karen stood tall on her porch, radiating smug confidence. She had already told anyone who would listen that I was about to be exposed for stealing her land. She grinned when the surveyors unloaded their gear, as if the verdict was already written in stone. I, on the other hand, carried the weight of uncertainty. Deep down, I trusted the fence had been placed correctly. But what if there had been a mistake years ago? What if I was wrong? The surveyors worked with quiet precision. They hammered markers into the soil, measured distances with lasers, and cross-checked old plats with the current layout of the neighborhood. I hovered close, enough to observe, but far enough not to interfere, my heart thudding harder with each reading they recorded. Karen, meanwhile, paced like a predator waiting for the kill, her arms folded, her lips curled into a self-satisfied smirk. Hours passed. Finally, one of the surveyors called me over to explain their findings. Karen was quick to follow, inserting herself into the conversation uninvited. The surveyor unrolled a map of the property lines, pointing out the bright red markers that represented my land versus Karen's. And that's when the truth came crashing down like a tidal wave. The fence wasn't on her property at all. In fact, it wasn't even close. The measurements revealed that the fence sat entirely within my boundary line, and more shockingly, it was Karen's own garden shed that crossed the line. By nearly 2 feet. I stood frozen, blinking at the surveyors, words letting them sink in. Karen's smugness evaporated instantly. Her confident posture crumbled as she stared at the map in disbelief. She demanded rechecks, insisted there had to be a mistake, even accused the surveyors of bias. But no amount of protest could erase the cold, hard numbers. The fence wasn't the problem. Karen was. The crowd of neighbors who had gathered began murmuring, their whispers carrying a mix of amusement and judgment. The woman who had spent weeks campaigning against me had just exposed her own violation of property lines. Suddenly, the self-appointed enforcer of rules was the one caught breaking them, but it didn't stop there. The surveyors explained that the encroachment of her shed wasn't just a minor oversight. It was a violation that could legally require her to dismantle or relocate the structure. Karen's face drained of color as the weight of that reality sank in. For me, the relief was overwhelming. Not only was my fence safe, but I now held undeniable proof that Karen had waged a war built entirely on lies and arrogance. The tables had turned completely, and for the first time since this ordeal began, I felt the power shift squarely in my favor. Still, I knew this was only the beginning. Karen wasn't the type to admit defeat gracefully. If anything, being proven wrong would only make her more desperate, more unpredictable. And as I glanced at her trembling hands and furious eyes, I could already sense that she wasn't going to let this go quietly. The survey was done, the truth was undeniable, but the real battle was about to begin. Because Karen wasn't just humiliated, she was cornered. And when people like her are cornered, they lash out in ways you never see coming. Humiliation is a powerful thing. For most people, it humbles them, teaches them to step back and rethink their choices. But for Karen, it did the opposite. Being proven wrong in front of the entire neighborhood, with surveyors and neighbors alike watching her shed exposed as the real violation, lit a fire inside her that burned hotter than ever. The very next day, I saw her marching across her lawn, phone in hand, speaking with the clipped, angry tone of someone giving orders. I didn't need to hear the words to know what she was doing. She was calling the HOA. Karen wasn't going to accept defeat, not when she could twist the rules and bend the system in her favor. Sure enough, within the week, a new letter arrived. In my mailbox, the HOA claimed that while the fence may technically be on my property, its appearance was in violation of community standards. They demanded I repaint it in approved neutral colors and warned that failure to comply could result in daily fines. It was a transparent attempt to punish me for winning the property line dispute, and I knew exactly who was behind it. Karen's influence on the HOA board quickly became clear. She began attending meetings, sitting in the front row, whispering into the ears of board members and presenting herself as the concerned voice of the neighborhood. It wasn't long before every minor issue on my property Whether it was the color of my shutters, the plants in my garden, or even the placement of my trash cans, suddenly became the subject of official warnings. Neighbors started noticing the pattern. Some laughed at the absurdity, while others shook their heads in sympathy, but Karen didn't care about appearances anymore. She cared about one thing only: revenge. If she couldn't force me to tear down the fence, she would bury me under a mountain of rules and fines until I gave up out of exhaustion. I kept every letter, every notice, every photograph the HOA sent me of my so-called violations. My frustration grew with each envelope I opened, but so did my determination. Karen thought she could drown me in paperwork, but what she didn't realize was that I was building a case of my own. Each petty accusation, each frivolous claim, was more evidence of harassment, evidence that could eventually turn the HOA against her. The turning point came one evening when I overheard a conversation between two neighbors while working in my yard. They whispered about how Karen had been bragging that she could control the HOA and make life miserable for anyone she didn't like. That was the moment I knew her plan wasn't just about me. It was about power. She wanted to dominate the neighborhood, and I just happened to be the unlucky target who stood in her way. But power grabs always have cracks, and Karen was too arrogant to notice hers. She hadn't just made enemies with me. She was rubbing other neighbors the wrong way, too. The constant drama, the endless complaints, the suffocating rules. People were getting tired of her crusade, and I realized something important. I didn't have to fight Karen alone. If I could rally the other neighbors, if I could expose Karen's manipulation of the HOA for everyone to see, then she wouldn't just lose her fight against me, she'd lose her grip on the entire community. The fence war had started as a simple property line dispute, but now it was something much bigger. Karen had made it personal. She wanted to break me. But in her obsession, she had created the perfect opportunity for me to strike back in a way she never saw coming. By now, the feud had spread beyond the fence. It was no longer just about wood and property lines. It had become a battle for control of the entire neighborhood. Karen had thrown herself into the HOA like a general preparing for war, weaponizing every rule she could find. She thought she had me pinned down, trapped in a web of fines and citations. But what she didn't realize was that she had overplayed her hand. Her constant meddling wasn't just targeting me anymore. One by one, other neighbors began to feel her sting. She complained about the Smiths' garden gnomes, calling them unapproved decorations. She filed a grievance against the Thompsons because their teenage son parked his car too close to the curb. She even tried to fine the elderly couple down the street for having non-compliant shutters that had been on their house for decades. Karen thought she was tightening her grip, but what she was really doing was alienating the very people she needed on her side. And I saw the shift happening, slow but steady, like cracks spreading across glass. At first, the neighbors grumbled quietly, rolling their eyes at Karen's antics. But soon, they began seeking me out, asking questions, venting their frustrations, and sharing stories of their own battles with her. It was in those conversations that I saw my opportunity. If Karen wanted to use the HOA as her weapon, I would use the neighborhood as my shield and my army. I started small. I shared the results of my property survey with a few trusted neighbors, letting them see the undeniable proof that Karen had lied about my fence. I showed them the stack of petty citations I had received, highlighting the absurdity of being fined for things as trivial as flower colors and trash can placement. The neighbors shook their heads, laughed, and most importantly, began to talk. Word spread quickly, faster than Karen could contain it. Within weeks, Karen's reputation as the protector of the neighborhood began to crumble. She wasn't seen as a guardian of rules anymore. She was seen as a bully, drunk on power, determined to control everyone around her. And the more she pushed, the more people resisted. But I knew gossip alone wouldn't be enough. If I wanted to truly put an end to this, I needed something bigger, something undeniable that the HOA couldn't ignore. That's when I remembered the shed, Karen's shed. The very structure sitting illegally on my property was the crack in her armor. While she was busy accusing others, she was guilty of the very thing she hated most, breaking the rules. I dug through the surveyor's report again, highlighting the section that clearly showed the encroachment. I cross-referenced HOA bylaws, finding the exact clauses that required homeowners to remove or modify any structure built outside their boundaries. And there it was, her violation in black and white, clear as day. The plan began to form in my mind. I wouldn't just defend myself anymore. I would take the fight straight to the source. I would present my evidence at the next HOA meeting, not privately, not quietly, but in front of every board member and every neighbor who had grown tired of Karen's crusade. The day of the meeting arrived, and the atmosphere was electric. Neighbors filled the small clubhouse, whispering among themselves, casting glances at Karen as she strutted in with her usual air of superiority. She sat at the front, already preparing her stack of complaints, convinced she was about to unleash another wave of fines on me, but this time things would be different. This time, I wasn't the one on trial. I had the evidence. I had the neighbors' support, and soon I would have the floor. The HOA clubhouse had never been this full. Folding chairs lined the walls, neighbors squeezed into the back, and even those who usually skipped meetings showed up, sensing something big was about to unfold. The air buzzed with tension, a mix of curiosity and quiet anticipation. For weeks, Karen had dominated the HOA meetings with her relentless stream of complaints, and most people expected more of the same. What they didn't know was that tonight, everything was going to change. Karen arrived early, striding to the front row with her usual confidence. She carried a thick folder stuffed with papers, printouts of rules, photographs of supposed violations, and undoubtedly more ammunition aimed squarely at me. She glanced around the room, nodding at board members as if she were the queen of the neighborhood. Her smirk widened when she saw me walk in. To her, this was just another chance to embarrass me. The meeting began with routine agenda items, maintenance updates, budget reports, landscaping contracts. But no one was really listening. Everyone was waiting for the fireworks. And sure enough, when the board asked if there were any new community concerns, Karen shot her hand into the air. She launched into her usual tirade, listing my supposed violations, the non-neutral color of my shutters, the position of my trash bins, and of course the ever-present fence. Her voice carried across the room with the authority of someone who thought she had already won. Neighbors exchanged glances, some rolling their eyes, others shaking their heads. But Karen didn't notice. She was too busy building her case, her words dripping with smug satisfaction. And then it was my turn. I stood up slowly, deliberately, carrying a thin folder of my own. Unlike Karen's, it wasn't stuffed with trivial complaints. Inside was one simple, devastating piece of evidence: the property survey. The room quieted as I stepped forward. I began calmly, explaining how the survey had proven my fence was entirely on my property. A few neighbors nodded. They already knew the truth from our conversations. Karen, however, immediately interrupted, waving her arms and shouting that the survey was rigged and inaccurate. That's when I pulled out the enlarged copy of the survey map. I laid it on the table for everyone to see, the bold lines and measurements leaving no room for debate. I pointed out the markers, highlighted the boundary lines, and then drew everyone's attention to the key detail: the shed. Karen's shed, the one sitting 2 feet onto my property. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by murmurs of disbelief. People leaned in closer, pointing at the map, whispering to each other. Karen's face turned pale, then red, as she stammered excuses, insisting it was a minor oversight, but the damage was done. The enforcer of rules had just been exposed as the worst violator of them all. I didn't stop there. I read aloud the section of the HOA bylaws that required any encroaching structure to be removed or relocated at the homeowner's expense. The room fell silent as the words echoed. Karen, who had spent weeks weaponizing those very bylaws against me, was now trapped by them herself. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. For weeks, they had entertained Karen's complaints, but now they saw the truth. Her credibility evaporated in an instant, and as neighbors began to speak up, sharing their own stories of harassment, recounting her endless nitpicking and openly questioning her motives, the tide turned completely. By the time I finished, Karen was no longer the accuser. She was the accused. The HOA board, backed by a now united neighborhood, had no choice but to address the violation. A formal notice would be issued, requiring her to either move or dismantle her shed within 60 days. Karen sat frozen, her folder of complaints forgotten in her lap. The woman who had once strutted into meetings with unshakable authority now looked small, cornered, and utterly defeated. But even then, I knew this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't the type to accept humiliation quietly. She would scheme, she would plot, and she would find some way to fight back. And yet, for the first time in months, I felt the neighborhood on my side. The war wasn't over, but the balance of power had shifted. The question was, how far would Karen go to try and claw it back? For most people, public humiliation at an HOA meeting would be the end of the story. They would quietly accept defeat, maybe nurse their pride in private, and eventually move on. But Karen wasn't like most people. Her pride wasn't just bruised, it was shattered. And when people like Karen lose control, they don't give up. They double down. In the weeks following the meeting, I could feel her desperation growing. The HOA's formal notice arrived at her doorstep, giving her 60 days to either relocate her shed or face mounting fines. Neighbors who once avoided her now crossed the street to whisper about her downfall. Where she once strutted confidently through the neighborhood, she now glared from her porch, seething in silence. But silence didn't last. Late one night, I heard the sound of hammering, coming from her yard. At first, I thought she might actually be complying with the notice, but as I peered through my window, I realized what was happening. Karen wasn't dismantling the shed. She was attempting to move the property markers themselves. She thought she could rewrite the survey by physically shifting the stakes in the ground, erasing the proof of her violation. The audacity was almost unbelievable. But what Karen didn't know was that she wasn't alone that night. Two neighbors out for a walk caught her in the act. They filmed her on their phones as she pulled the bright red markers from the soil and shoved them several feet into my yard. The next morning, the video spread like wildfire across the neighborhood's private Facebook group. It was the final nail in her coffin. When the HOA board saw the footage, they couldn't ignore it. Tampering with property markers wasn't just dishonest, it was illegal. Within days, a letter went out, not just fining Karen for her shed, but citing her for misconduct that could jeopardize her standing in the association altogether. Some neighbors even whispered about involving local authorities, though the board decided to handle it internally. The fallout was swift. Karen's once feared reputation was reduced to ridicule. Neighbors who had once tolerated her now openly mocked her antics. Her attempts to wield power over the community had backfired so completely that she became the very thing she despised most, a laughingstock. By the time her 60-day deadline arrived, the shed was gone. Whether she dismantled it herself or hired someone to do the work, I never found out. What I did know was that the backyard where she once gloated now stood empty, a symbol of her collapse. As for me, I kept my fence exactly where it had always been, standing tall, unshaken, and stronger than ever. But it wasn't just a fence anymore. It was a reminder of a battle fought and won, not with anger, but with patience, persistence, and proof. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal. The HOA, embarrassed by how easily they had been manipulated, adopted new rules to prevent one homeowner from dominating the board. Neighbors grew closer, united by the shared ordeal of living under Karen's reign of pettiness. And me, I found myself at peace again, enjoying my yard without the constant weight of complaints hanging over me. As for Karen, she remained in the neighborhood, but she was never the same. The power she once wielded was gone. She stopped attending meetings, stopped filing complaints, and avoided the stares of neighbors who remembered every moment of her downfall. She had wanted control, but in the end, all she gained was isolation. The war of the fence was finally over. What began as a simple dispute had spiraled into a full-blown neighborhood drama, but in the end, the truth had stood firm. My fence hadn't just marked the boundary of my property. It had marked the boundary between Karen's lies and reality, and in that battle, reality had won.